But once again, I welcome all of you to the second of our international lecture series for the year 2000. As you all know, this evening we have Dr. Uma Chakravarti, who has been here twice before and spoken last year as well, so some of you will be familiar with her personally and her work. Today she's speaking on persistent structures, ideological maneuvers and everyday challenges, women's movements in South Asia. Dr. Uma Chakravarti teaches history at Miranda House College for Women, University of Delhi. She is the author of The Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism and Rewriting History, the Life and Times of Pandita Ramabai, and has co-authored The Delhi Riots, 3 Days in the Life of a Nation. Uma Chakravarti is associated with the women's movement and the democratic rights movement in India. She's a member of the People's Union for Democratic Rights and has participated in many joint fact-finding teams dealing with problems of communalism, women's rights and agrarian struggles. She has been involved in numerous campaigns undertaken by the women's movement and has tried to create a safe campus for women in the campus in which she works and in others. Apart from the books already mentioned, she has written extensively on gender, class and labor. This year, we decided to arrange for some of our international faculty to speak in Islamabad. Some of you may remember that last week we had Christine Delphi with us. She's gone back to Colombo and then to Paris, but she has left Lucille behind as our local Parisian. Last Friday, we introduced Uma and Christine, and indeed Women's Studies and Feminism, to the glitterati of Islamabad. We were in fact amazed at the response, since we imagined that Islamabad is so fossilized into mainstream or male-stream development that it had lost the ability to think, let alone to dream. But wonder of all wonders, we had 2 ministers, several ex-ministers, 5 ambassadors and other senior personnel from the diplomatic corps, all senior United Nations and bilateral representatives, usually they're number 1, people from universities, vice-chancellors, and of course NGOs and women's groups. And all of this for feminism. Maybe we still have a chance. Uma was in fact such a hit that PTV, like Sun Television, included her and the seminar itself in its 9 o'clock news on the 5th. A politically significant event, since the very fact that an Indian feminist was speaking in Islamabad on the same day when others were threatening war made for an enormously powerful political statement on women's solidarity that transcends national boundaries. To a large extent, this is the underpinning. It also says that we have some links with PTV, but that's another matter. Or we can bully them enough into this. To a large extent, this is the underpinning of this institute, and I hope that the students, all of you, and ourselves can work to build on the bridges and the links that have brought us together. And I present to you Dr. Uma Chakravarti.
Last year I went into some effort to put on my sari and say that I'm going to, and this year I'm in my natural clothes, which is what I wear right through the winter and which I feel very comfortable in. So you can see that I'm feeling very much on at home. Last year I did stick with my broad framework of history, and that's what I talked to you all about. This year I feel that again, we've moved a step forward, and I can talk to you about my understanding of the way in which South Asian women's movements have shared certain experiences. Of course, they have distinctive histories and distinctive issues around which they've mobilized. But there is a commonality, I think, in many of the South Asian women's movements, apart from the one that we are striving for, which is just maintaining the links between ourselves. So I feel extremely privileged to be able to share with you my understanding of South Asian women's movements, and I will not, of course, in a continuous way touch on or be able to include all the things that are going on in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh and Nepal. But I think the broad argument that I'm trying to make should hold for most of South Asia. I will draw from my own understanding, which is specifically of the Indian women's movement, but as I said, I will try and make connections wherever I go. Now, I'm going to begin with an anecdote, which I apologize to the ASR crowd, which was there in Islamabad and has heard it, and Bunny and Nussi, who were there. But I think it's a useful starting point for me, particularly because it is actually something that does lead me on to my argument about persisting structures and the ideological maneuvers that we are constantly actually having to face. I mean, the theme of this paper is persistent structures because the structures are have persisted across they are the long-duration, the long-term, long unfolding processes that we see. The ideological maneuvers, you may see, are varying from century to century, from decade to decade in our countries. And the everyday challenges, as you will understand, are of a kind that we don't even know where it's going to come from. You know, suddenly you'll be hit in the belly by something which you thought you had dealt with many years before. So now the entry point is this little anecdote that I want to tell, which is of my student. Now I teach in a women's college in Miranda House, which is 50 years old, a little more than 50 years old. It is a college which produced the first generation of feminists in Delhi, many of whom went on to being very, very active. And so there was a lively atmosphere in my college during the 60s and 70s. Now, many years later, in the last year, I ran into one of my old students. She was a very well trained photographer, and I came across her because I was asked to do a book on the illustrated history of ancient India, and I got very excited and I said, okay, this is my opportunity to ensure that the gender biases of the last millennium, it was supposed to be a millennium volume, so I said, at least we can dump the gender biases of the last millennium, leave it behind over there, and in the new millennium we would not have this. So we'll write a new kind, I was going to do a new kind of history book. And since it was going to be illustrated, the first thing you have to deal with is I'm not going to have any of those freezes that exist, in our sculptures, which actually lock women into those frozen positions. Basically, the object of, they may be great art, but they nevertheless do reduce and bound women in very stereotypical ways. So I was getting very excited, and I was asking her for photographs, because she'd done a lot of photographs. And I asked her, I want women laboring, I want women in this way, in that way, in all sorts of ways. And then after a little while, she said, are you one of those strident feminists? So she just quickly, she got a hang of what I was saying, but she also put it in a particular way. Now, this was very interesting because she herself was a completely independent, very self-confident woman photographer who went all over the place. It absolutely, she was just completely, she was doing her own thing with no concern for anybody at all. And yet, this woman, who was, to my mind, represented for me what would be the feminist individual who is autonomous, was saying, are you one of those strident feminists? And she was putting me into a pigeonhole. Basically, that's what she was doing. So I said, yes, because I'm now very tired of this thing of I am not a feminist, but which Christine was talking about last week. I said, yes, I am just a feminist. And I noticeably dropped the strident, because the strident is not automatically a qualification of feminism. But that's what has been gotten on. So feminist itself is bad, then you can't have a feminist who's not strident. All feminists are strident. There's no way that you can be just a feminist, So I say, now this pigeonhole is actually actually what it's all about. How does this pigeonhole come into existence? While it's a pigeonhole everywhere, it's a pigeonhole even in the West, but it's much more of a pigeonhole in our part of the world. That is, you can't say you're a feminist because feminist here automatically gets linked with being Western. So it's not just that you're a feminist, but it automatically links you up with the West. And that's really the problem that I'm going to address. And I'm going to read this paper with bits and pieces that I shall present impromptu. But I'm going to read this paper because I think I am making some points here and I want to stick with the points that I'm making. Now, there are other kinds of pigeonholes we in South Asia have to confront. Apart from the economic exploitation and political domination that colonialism entails, it is the psychological and cultural consequences that are particularly significant for women. Cultural nationalism is a highly emotive way of binding together a subject people still living under colonial rule. In South Asia, it was the bedrock of the movements for independence. Because really, before we had the movement for independence, we had cultural nationalist revivalism. The East-West dichotomy was especially applicable to women's status, where the liberation of the Western woman, standing here for rampant individualism and the inability to be nurturant, was contrasted with the unique capacity of the woman of the East to sacrifice themselves for the good of others. Now this has come in variations. I'm sure there have been variations in Islam, in Hinduism, in whatever. But we got it most effectively in the hands of, in the working of Swami Vivekananda. You know, he actually posited women of the East with women of the West. And he said, women of the West, they can't be mothers. That is, they're basically rampant individuals who can't actually have the nurturant quality. And women of the East are mothers and nurtured by their the very culture that has created this kind of a personality. Now, this thing of the nurturant Eastern woman, the capacity to sacrifice and smilingly sacrifice is really the element that's built into this kind of personality. So, built into a powerful trope, this model of womanhood made it difficult to articulate women's interests or to recognize the material basis of patriarchies operative in the East just as much as they are operative in the West. And that is what has required a women's movement across the globe. You see, the point is that it's not the culture in and of itself that is oppressive, but there is a material basis to the oppression and the subordination of women. And we really need to recognize that, and that exists across the globe. So that's why the women's question was an important part of cultural nationalism, making social reform pertaining to women a highly contested and explosive terrain. No transformation of unequal gender relations or even addressing the problem in any sustained manner was possible till the end of colonialism. And we all know what happened, that as we would raise the question of women's situation, women's independence, you would be told, wait for independence. And this again was very, very emotively put across by Tilak. Now, the figures that I constantly mention are right-wing. This is the right-wing tradition, but nevertheless, they were very popular in their time. So you have Tilak who says, we will not have the household or women's, we will not have any legal reform, even if it is progressive, till we are an independent people. So nothing from the colonial state, even if it is actually something that would be positive. So this thing of closing doors up to an outsider and not allowing them to intervene in your social and economic processes, this is the position that actually was taken by the cultural nationalists. So you had to wait till the end of colonialism before these issues could be addressed. Now the continuing anxieties about identities of nations or peoples of the new nation states in relation to women, however, still makes it difficult. See, it's like we would have thought that we ended colonialism, now we can get on with it. But the new nation states are still anxious in their relationship with the West, and so we find that it is difficult to lay the ghost of the East-West dichotomy to rest. It is most persistently rehearsed to brand the women's movements of South Asia as derivatives of and oriented towards the West by its opponents. Okay? The Western stigma not only has an emotive power in a colonial, post-colonial society, but it also has the power to deflect from fundamental issues women are raising. See, if you bring in the cultural question of this is Western, you don't actually have to look at what is happening today. So it will be my effort throughout this presentation to demonstrate the very specific location of the movements in this region to the social and political context here. So my point is that I'm going to combat this whole notion that it is Western, it's a Western derivative. Our movements have originated here, on our soil, on our contradictions. It is our contradictions that we are dealing with, not the Western derived contradictions. And what I want to do is to indicate that the West-derived label is both without substance and in fact a way of denying the material basis of women's subordination, a convenient escape route for those who themselves are implicated in reproducing the inequalities of gender. Let's have no doubts about this. That is, anyone who's telling you this now, so many years afterwards, is doing so because they're trying to deny the basis, the material basis of patriarchy here. That's the agenda. Now, all right. Now, across South Asia, women's movements originated roughly in the 70s, more or less a quarter of a century after these nation states came into existence. In essence, this movement had a broader social context than recognizing inequalities of gender, because the women's movement was not the only thing that came at this time, but were in fact closely linked to a crisis of state power. It's more or less 25 years since the countries became independent, and in the late 60s and early 70s, a series of movements punctured the complacencies of the political elites. The unrest was rooted in the failure of the political system to what, in colloquial parlance, is called to deliver the goods. I mean, these states had failed to deliver the goods. And the expectations of its huge populations of deprived people. I mean, this is a very poor area which has its basic material contradictions. And these were being articulated in the late 60s and early 70s. So the structural crisis resulted in a leftward shift in oppositional politics. So in the late 60s, this is what is happening. There's a leftward shift that is taking place as peasants, tribals, workers, Dalits, students, and women protested the state's failure on virtually every front. There'd been a failure, complete failure on every front. Although exacerbated by colonial rule, many of these social contradictions originated in our own homegrown material and social arrangements and were problems of the long period on the subcontinent. I mean, for instance, caste is not something that the colonial powers created. Unequal land structures is not what the West created. These we had. Gender contradictions we'd had right from. So basically, then these were our contradictions. There were two ways in which the women's movement was organically linked to the political context. So there is this wider political context where all of this is being critiqued. Women were as materially affected as men by the economic crisis, so they were an intrinsic part and in some cases even the largest component of a movement, and many movements like the Shahada movement of tribals in Western India, they were articulating class issues as well as gender issues. At the same time, women activists drawn from the middle class as well as peasant and tribal women found that the gender question was not being addressed within the otherwise democratic and often radical movements that they were part of. Early manifestations of the need for organizing as women did not fully develop immediately in India because we had the imposition of the emergency. Now, of course, the classic thing is when there's a crisis in the state, you simply clamp down, and you clamp down in various ways. In some place you may have a coup, in another place you may have an emergency. And what we had in India was a civil emergency, which Mrs. Gandhi imposed. Basically, her power was being questioned. And so this mushrooming and this flowering that you had, and this absolute explosive moment in which everybody was asking questions. Everybody was asking some kind of question or the other. Very powerful student movements were taking place, and they were coming in Gandhian tradition, in the left tradition, in also in a socialist tradition. So various articulations of this you could see. So now, after the emergency, of course, was a very important point. But when the emergency was finally withdrawn, this was the moment for the emergence of civil rights movement in a big way, a democratic rights movement in a big way, and the women's movement. So by the late 70s, you do get the articulation of the women's movement. Now, the women's movements in India was late 70s. There is the emergence of a nationwide campaign. It's not that the women's movement owes its origin to late 70s. The women's movement goes back to at least the late 60s, early 70s, because in Hyderabad, in Bombay, feminists had begun to raise issues even in the early 70s. But in the post-emergency period, because people had formulated ways by which they could actually link up with each other during the emergency, this question of being able to link up, even though you may individually be struggling across the different parts of the of India, had materialized. So the first nationwide campaign was around the issue of an issue of custodial rape. Now again, here I want to stress the importance of this. The issue was there was a poor tribal girl called Mathura who was raped in a police thana in Western India. She was tribal, so low status, came from a different set of cultural norms. So this made her, marked for a particular kind of view of her, which the judgment which there was a judgment against this in the context of this rape case, which actually exacerbated the inequalities and the biases of the upper class elite, because the judgment was extremely retrogressive. It suggested that Mathura was not a chaste woman, and they were deriving their notions of chastity from upper caste practices. So anyway, the point is that custodial rape is the issue around which people mobilize. Now, third world states know the power of the thana in a very material way, and so it's not any issue that's picked up. It is actually custodial rape that is picked up as the first to campaign around. Immediately and around the same time, it was dowry murders. Now again, it's a very specific phenomenon. It's a very specific phenomenon at that point of time, basically in northern India. And these were the campaigns that were picked up by the various women's groups across the country. And they raised and had an extremely powerful women's movement. Now, we know that the crisis of the state or particular kinds of legal initiatives have been extremely important across South Asia. I think this is something that's shared across the board. We know, for instance, I have learned from my interactions with all of you that this holds true for the early 80s and what is happening in Pakistan, because it is the Hudud ordinances, which in a sense do create a certain kind of groundswell for. It's time for me to make a point that I would like to hear, which is struggles around the law have often been the precipitating moment for movements, especially in the case of women. And increasingly recently there's a trend within postmodernism to basically question the whole point of getting involved in the law on the ground that the law is always and in and of itself hegemonic. So it's always going to be unfair, it's always going to be something that will be biased. So virtually suggesting that struggles in the field of law are no use. Now, this is actually a terrible position to take, because whether we struggle in the area of law or not, the law is going to affect us. So we can't stop and say we are not going to engage in struggles as far as the law is concerned, because the law will operate on us in any case. And it is as much a field that we must be engaged in as any other, because it is something that works on the lives of women. So anyone who suggests that this is something to be questioned is, I think, functioning in the framework of a radical right position rather than a radical position, and we should really understand that. So the legal issues were crucial at this point of time, and it has been in places like Rajasthan and so on also. It's been big beginnings. Now, this is the moment at which the women's movement actually is at its most creative point. It is, and this is something that again I've learned from my interactions with friends in Pakistan. It's the most creative because this is the point at which you have to try and use every single strategy to draw attention to women's oppression. And you have to do it by addressing culture, you have to do it by addressing tradition, you have to address it by looking at the law, and you have to do it, and you have to be able to do it by holding the attention of your audiences in a way in which you capture their attention. So the street play and forms of cultural mobilization which we had left behind at the time of IPTA, at the time of our IPTA tradition, were actually it's feminists who brought it back. It's feminists, and now civil rights groups use it, now left groups have gone back to using it. But there was a period in between that I think the left groups had virtually not innovated with these forms. And of course, standing right here, I have had the most delightful experience of watching Salima and Shoaib performing their little play on the Hudud Ordinance. This is something which was absolutely fantastic for me, because we never managed to use humor as sustainedly. We would work with street plays, but they would be heavy, and there would be bits of humor, here and there. But we wouldn't get this thing of, the whole thing is a gag. It's like a long gag that you're using, a long series of comedy moves that you're making in order to make a very serious point, because humor was being used subversively. Now, we would do a sort of straight narrative, but we would also bring in bits like, the spoilt brat son of a household which is trying to get its consumer goods through the dowry, would be used as a gag, and you'd find young men who'd come along saying, "Papa, Papa, mujhe scooter chahiye," and he'd come, whee, making the motions of a scooterist. But basically, it was little bits. The rest of it was grim. But he had a very creative time talking about, using ways in which you could talk about custodial rape, about dowry, about unequal access to education, to all sorts of things. And I'll give you one lovely line that I just adore from one of the plays that was done, which all of us will sympathize with. The unequal access to education. So there's this play called Roshni. Roshni has to struggle to go to college. Roshni has to struggle to go to, she's born as a girl child, she has this difficulty, then she goes to school, then she argues to go to college, because they're trying to get her married off. And then, of course, then there's this policing that takes place. That is, if you go to college, then you have to come back straight. So one day, she comes home late. And typically then, late meaning, she's coming home not at 1 o'clock as soon as her class is over, but at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock or whatever it is. And you have the brother. Always brothers do the policing, speak on behalf of the father. And he grabs hold of the sister and he said, "Where have you been? The whole household has been so worried about you," and so on. And, don't you know what will happen to you in the street? If you go out into the street, what other men will do to you? And she turns around and she looks at him like this. She said, "Tu kyun nahi ghar mein baith jata? The problem is coming from the men. Why don't you put yourselves inside and let us get onto the street?" What is this nonsense? That is, they have the right to the street, and they will tell you to stay inside. You are creating the problem, you stay inside the house. And I will go where I want. So anyway, all of this was used during this period. Now, the most important thing I think that is happening at this point of time is that women's movement is conceptualizing women's oppression in a radically different way. That's where we differ between first wave, the last generation, the 19th century, early 20th century also, and the women's movement post 70s women's movement. It's the women's issue is being articulated and understood in very different ways. And now you are centrally addressing the question of patriarchy. you are naming it, you're giving the institution a name, and you are saying this is what is responsible for the subordination of women. So it's the radically different terms in which women's oppression and women's subordination is being conceptualized. So the enormity of the discrimination women faced and their essential homelessness, the denial of basic constitutional and human rights, their experience of violence and the cultural practices under which their subordination was invisibilized, all began to coalesce around an incipient feminist consciousness, and this provided the backdrop for the emergence of the women's movement. So essentially then, it's the connections, all of these connections that they are addressing. Now, very briefly, I want to go over two important women's movements, because it's also been suggested, I don't know if it's as much of a problem in Pakistan and other parts of South Asia, but I know in India we often get this, that the women's movement is an urban phenomenon. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's all out here. And in reality, there have been actually many movements across in different locations. The media is hooked on to the urban women's movement, because the media can use that to show the narrow base, and the media can also trash them by saying, look, these are Western feminists, So essentially that's what is that. Now, two important movements which took place roughly around the same time, which I'll quickly go over from the point of view of trying to make some larger points. This is the Chipko movement, which is like been put on the world map. It's the most important movement of South Asia, and I'll tell you why I have anxieties about it, even though you're going to now have the best-known spokeswoman of the Chipko movement coming and speaking to you perhaps next week. You'll all be here, and I don't want to undercut her, because I think what she's coming here for is very important, and we should all be absolutely sympathetic. But on the issue of Chipko, I have reservations, and I'm going to present them to you just now. Now, the Chipko movement originated roughly in the hill areas of the Uttarakhand area. This is Vandana Shiva, for those who are looking confused about whom I'm referring to. So, the Chipko movement, roughly in the Uttarakhand region, the hill areas of Uttar Pradesh, where a movement was launched by women to protect the forests from depredations by commercial interests, in which their own menfolk were implicated. So there was a coalition between the state, between global forces, and we see them much more now, and the local men, that is the men of their own community, because cash would be brought in immediately. And so you had contractors, the state, the local men, and where the wood or whatever it is going to end up in a coalition of interests. Now, instinctively, women protested this because they were the ones who suffered the consequences of ecological degradation, because they had to go and fetch the fodder of the forests were the resource for their firewood. So the basic, it was fuel for their cooking pot that they had to go and fetch, and this would affect them. So women then used strategies. It's called the Chipko movement because you went and hugged the tree and refused to allow the contractor to come and cut it. So this is, and women's spontaneous, non-violent strategy did have an impact, and at least for the moment, it did end the penetration. It hasn't succeeded, because we are back to phase 2, and this is happening, and I don't think that the Chipko movement is very active any longer over there. But anyway, in precisely that area. Now, the reason why this movement was actually quite, it's not that it did not interrogate processes, it interrogated processes of development, it interrogated the state and its policies. It also, to some extent, raised questions about their own men, about their husbands and fathers, who were more happy to sell the wood than they were. But it did not actually go beyond that, in the sense that they resisted, they caused a certain setback for the depredations for the moment, and they finally went on to other issues that they were to raise, including liquor, that is, the drinking. They turned their attention in the direction of the brewing of liquor and the contractors again. Now, what is very interesting is in both these situations, they actually targeted the outsider. They didn't target their own men, saying, why are you implicated in this? But even in the drinking, they didn't target their own men, saying, why is it that they went along with the notion that liquor was increasing their oppression. Not that the basis of their oppression is already there, and men's drinking only enhances the power that they already have. It doesn't create a power. It only enhances the power. So these questions were never asked. Besides which, because it was non-violent and it was this thing of nurturant, you're going and, linking up with nature, you're protecting nature, it actually reiterated and reinforced some of the understanding that women are naturally nurturant. The Gandhian strategy on the one hand of non-violence and the nurturant quality that they demonstrated by hugging the trees, and the connection that was made between women and nature, then meant for a circular set of connections which were not unconventional, which were quite acceptable within a traditional framework. Because it never transcended and never raised another set of questions where you would interrogate the power of men itself. You see? So, if the state was not regarded as a patriarchal state, it was regarded as a state which was, going in a certain direction, at least in the early stages of the movement. Now, in contrast, and in fact, a forest official felt it was a legitimate recourse, of women, because you're using non-violence as a strategy as well as using a nurturant connection. Now, in contrast, I want to mention the Bodh Gaya movement, which I think nobody has heard of. I don't think any of you heard of the Bodh Gaya movement. No? Yeah. Well, it tells you about international media. International media, Bodh Gaya, B-O-D-H and G-A-Y-A. It's a place. It's a place where there was a Mahant, a religious head, who had thousands of acres of land in central Bihar. And he then he was a big landlord, and there were a large number of agricultural laborers who worked for him. Now, the movement here was a socialist movement. It was also used Gandhian, it also used basically non-violence as a strategy, but it was important for two reasons. Women activists and men activists went into the field together. Men and women, agricultural laborers, were engaged in discussions together. And so their conceptualization that grew from this set of people were radically different from the kind of issues that were raised in Bodh Gaya. In Chipko. Now, here, the starting point was, do men make theory and we execute their strategy? This is between the male activists and the women activists. So, and the women activists say, no, we are going to be part of this theory making. The strategy has to be evolved collectively. None of this business of, comrade, you give me the line and then I will just execute it, So that's something that they are questioning. They work on it together. They, find ways of focusing, and they come to the questions which ask very radically different radically different sets of connections, and ask for very different kinds of measures that they want addressed. Now, what are the connections that they're making? One is that when they're all struggling, see, women are always, they're always in the front line. That is, when there's going to be a demonstration, women will be placed in front. And they will go and they'll lie down over there, and they will prevent you from coming forward. Even the guns and so on cannot be used so effectively if women are there. So they did that. They went and lay down on the field when the Mahant sent his men out to forcibly cultivate the grain. So they just went and lay down on the ground, women and children. They did that, but they didn't stop at that. They went ahead and they wanted the issue of gender associated with class. Now, this is a movement which is addressing class relations and gender relations simultaneously. Class relations is, we till the soil, we will get the land. We demand the land. And the Mahant doesn't, lift a finger. So he should be, all the land is ours. But when it comes to the question of all the land is ours, whose will it be? Is there male agricultural labourer going to get this land? Or are we both going to get the land? And here they got into a confrontation. The women agricultural labourers and the women activists got into a confrontation with the men. Because immediately the men said, look, once they are better off, everybody will be better off. The family will be better off. So the whole household will get land. And automatically everyone's status will rise. And they said no. And then their argument was that, look, he's the head of the household. He does more work. So these women came up with a fantastic strategy by which they created points. And they said, come on, let's make points about what you do and what we do. And tie it up to see who does more on the land. And this points itself was quite interesting because they started with, except for ploughing, which the men did, everything else was done either only by the women or by men and women together. So finally they came to the question, that knocked out the very basis of the argument that we can't get the land because you don't work it. They worked it just as much. But the most fascinating part of their theoretical development was the one that they make over here, which is, see, they'd also run their own anti-liquor campaign. But they had argued that men's power is enhanced when they drink, not that it starts with when they drink. And they came to the question that they formulated it like this. They said, if this man who has so much power over me already, if he gets the land, how much more power will he have over me? So the formulation is actually quite fascinating. That is, it's that this will enhance them even further. And so they refused to let the land, go without them getting it in their own name. Some of them have got it. Some people who went back recently have found, that they say, it's wonderful, we've got this little patch, but when we come out and we look at the sky above, we feel very pleased because this is mine. This is what I have. And that's an experience that we talk about. Now, the reason why Chipko has a certain circulation, a certain acceptance, and Bodh Gaya has been marginalized, it has important consequences for the way in which our own cultures have looked at the women's movement, and I think that's something that I need to keep in mind. Bunny, how much time do I have? Any amount of time. Okay. How much time do I have from the audience? Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Can I go ahead? Okay. All right. Now, both the Chipko and Bodh Gaya movements not only point to the range of issues around women and by women that were being addressed by movements, but the very intermeshing of material and cultural factors and the centrality of questions of survival, and these indicate the continuing failure of the state to even partially fulfill the aspirations of the people. So both these are central issues as far as our people are concerned. By the mid-80s in India, a second phase of the crisis of governance was manifesting itself. This time round, a rightward shift in politics was introduced, a new dimension into the women's movement. And that's really the sad point. After I tell this lovely story about Bodh Gaya, I have to get to the fact that we are moving in a rightward direction because the state has not delivered the goods. So you have this shift that is taking place. Similar shifts with similar links between political crises, manipulation of religious identities, and its impact on the women's movement at a different point of time hold for other countries of South Asia too. It's happened in Sri Lanka, it's happened in Pakistan, it's definitely happened in India. It is the experience of the region that as nation states experience a crisis of the legitimacy of the state and political instability, they move into a more sharply nationalist or religion-based nationalist position, which immediately affects women adversely. And this has happened across the globe. Now, a cynical manipulation of religious and ethnic identities within the larger framework of a stagnant economy, competition for scarce resources, economic resources, and political control has the potential to turn violent. And that's the fearful thing. In India, because of the multiplicity of religious groupings, ethnic groups, and the regional contradiction, very severe regional contradictions that we have, because we are such a, there is so many different eco-regions that we have in that space. So that this manipulation of religious identities has led to rioting, and from 84 onwards, we have seen communal riots taking place. First against the Sikhs, then against Muslims, and there have been in Northeast there have been clashes between Bodos and non-Bodos, between tribals of various kinds, and so on. So it's at this point that actually the women's movement itself begins to get impacted in very dramatic ways. See, one of the consequences that the emergence of religion-based politics, the impact that it has, it immediately fragments women into different sectoral groupings. And it creates identities which are regarded at that point of time as actually quite important to address. Because there's no doubt that if you are a beleaguered group, if you are feeling vulnerable because you're the object of attacks, there will be a natural desire to close ranks. You will see yourself as a person. Now, this happened, and to give you an example, for instance, many people, many young Sikhs who had, gone in completely different directions in the 70s and so on, after the 84 Sikh riots, you suddenly saw them beginning to wear turbans, which they had not worn. So many of them had cut their hair off. But they began to wear the turbans, and they wore the turbans because they didn't want to distance themselves from their own communities, because the community was beleaguered at that point of time. And in fact, they took to wearing the black turban, which was a sign of protest. That is, they stopped wearing multicolored turbans, and they wore the black turban because this was an indication that they were making a statement against the state. But the fact that this phenomenon, however, does therefore create natural alliances between women and their own communities. And this then raises a lot of anxieties and questions that you have of how far you raise the question of women as women, and when you have to give that up because the forces around you seem to be very complicated. Now, the women's movement as a whole is still combating that problem in a variety of ways. And but I want to move to a point which shows you that when religion is used by a minority community, what consequences it can have, which are, in a sense, if you have to choose between these two, it's less dangerous. When a majority community takes to using religion, it can have very much more pernicious consequences. And this happened with the sati phenomenon in Rajasthan. Now, in 87, there was a major sati. There was a woman who was immolated. We don't even use the word sati any longer, because we consider that this is a loaded term. When you say sati, it means virtuous woman. We don't want to give that the connotation. We call it instead widow immolation, where a woman burns a living woman burns on the pyre of her husband, and this is what happened in 87. Now, immediately, the women's movement, of course, it was thrown back at the idea that you had this, at this point of time, you still had something like this happening. But they were not confused on the basic issues. They were actually quite clear what the basic issues are. Here was a revival of tradition in very, very modernist forms, because now you had, a very commercialized phenomenon, consequences of sati, of this widow immolation. Now, the point here is, because cultural tradition and religion-based nationalism then says close ranks to the community, the Rajput community closed ranks around this widow immolation and said, because there was a huge women's movement which asked for certain legal enforcements, asked for the closure, a closure on, sati widow immolation had already been banned in 1827. But now they demanded that even the propagation of this, the ideology, had to be dealt with. So no pamphlet literature, no nothing which could circulate, no worship of the stones that were symbols of. They were demanding all of this. Now, there were huge mobilizations within Rajasthan in which a cross section of women, from all castes and classes, actually came forward against what had happened. Equally, there was a massive mobilization, this time concertedly by the Rajput community, and they went to court saying, you cannot ban this practice and the ideology because this is our culture. But always culture resides in the body of women. It's in the practices that are associated with women. You've never had a set of practices being critiqued which men have given up. It is basically practices that congeal around the body of a woman that becomes the issue. So the claiming the right to preserve tradition is now being articulated by the majority community through right-wing mobilization, because there were all these Swamijis and stuff like that who were involved in this. And it was a means by which a political group was seeking to consolidate its own position in an unstable political situation. See, there is this very volatile political situation. So it's in this context that we really consider that the situation was extremely, extremely dangerous. Now, one of the most striking things that happened around the issue of widow immolation and this phenomenon of this woman in 87, Deorala, it was called, the Deorala Roopkamar, was that for the first time we found intellectuals attacking women. Now this had never happened. We didn't have necessarily a good press. We also got the backlash, the stuff that these are feminists and stuff like that. But we hadn't got a direct assault on women who had raised the gender issue from the intellectuals. But we got it around Sati. And it came from what I call the high priest of indigenism, Ashish Nandi. So Ashish Nandi, who has a huge following in the West, is the man who made his direct critique of women. He said, basically he was suggesting that some of us women who were writing about Sati at that point of time, that is widow immolation at that time, and changing the name from Sati to widow immolation, that these women like me, hundreds of other women, were deracinated colonial products, English-educated colonial products, who were out of sync with our own people, with our own cultures. And he wasn't saying that Sati was a good thing, okay? But he said, we did not have a right to speak. And instead, he said, the only person who had a right to speak was Swami Agnivesh, who was a progressive Swamiji, because you can only speak from within the tradition. Now you can see the series of slides that are being made. From Chipko, which just has some nurturant qualities. Nurturance is the characteristic of women in South Asia. Indigenous practices are always valorized, indigenous connections are always valorized. And then you come to a series of connections in which you say, now this is something that only you can criticize only from within the tradition. And that means that I as a woman, now I think it's actually, if you look at it, it's actually completely horrendous. Because a man can speak, but someone like me who grew up in a very conventional home, very, sort of, it was not culturally something that was completely, it was not westernized at all. I did not have a right to speak because I was English educated. I could not stand against my own oppression, the oppression of my own people. And this, I think, is the kind of connections which come. Now the point is that this is a right-wing radical position. Again, you see, it's not a democratic radical position. It's a right-wing radical position. It sounds very, it sounds kind of acceptable to a lot of people, but it's actually very dangerous. And so the connections as you go moving in the direction of consolidating community identities. Because basically if you speak from within tradition, then you work within the framework of that traditional. So that's really among the things that. Now in the last bit, what I do want to look at is the slide from Valorizing Chipko over Bodh Gaya, from women who are nurturant and act on behalf of the community, using indigenous forms of protest, to a full-scale attack on women who mobilize against oppressive traditional practices of communities, was not only complete, but it was showing up an unexpected conjunction of indigenism and cultural fundamentalism. The indigenous position on the Rala controversy has to date been the most serious attack on the women's movement from outside its own ranks. We constantly criticize ourselves, but that's a different thing. It has also been the most unwarranted. Among the most distressing aspects of the rightward shift of politics and religious majoritarianism from the late 80s and early 90s in India is the complicity of women in the often violent mobilization by a combine of fascist religious majoritarian groups against different communities. So one of the things that we are now facing is women in the right wing, women who mobilize along the grain. And one of the most important things that we have to address is often you can see larger numbers of people there. And it is natural because, and it's confused again by the intelligentsia, male intelligence. Always it's men who confuse the issue. But it's the male intelligentsia in India that's confused the issue. You have Partha Chatterjee types and so on, who were completely taken aback by the fact that there were so many women in the mobilization of the right wing, religious right wing, who came out and used the slogans of the women's movement. We coined the slogan saying, "Hum Bharat ki nari hain, phool nahi chingari hain." And that was taken up and used by the right wing to incite right wing men to go off and riot. You see? So this situation, now immediately the men get very flustered and say, it is because we are out of sync. Again, we don't know how to handle, we are out of touch with our own culture. The fact of the matter is, they will always have larger numbers. Which is, in and of itself, it's not even true, because the left in left women's organizations, some of them have, thousands of members. But anyway, they might be able to put from time to time larger numbers of people on the street. We mobilize always against the grain. We not only mobilize on issues of gender, we mobilize on class, we mobilize on caste. We're constantly doing things which are against. Our agenda is a more democratic agenda. It is a whole scale. It's a non-oppressive agenda. Therefore, you have to mobilize against entrenched power in all directions. Obviously, it's going to be much tougher. And it is not, we're constantly told, why aren't you women protesting about this or that or the other? As if to say we are a very small group of people and we can't. It's not that we are a small group of people. It is because the level of contradiction is so huge that we don't have enough people to address it unless we have actually everybody joining ranks. But anyway, so right-wing mobilization definitely is a problem that we are faced with at the moment, and we have to take this on board and move in the direction of a more democratic agenda. Now, before we can settle all this problem, we are being faced with another onslaught, and now the onslaught is coming from global capitalism, from imperialism. We have now opened up in India, and this is leading to its own contradictions. Now, the women's movement in India, like other movements for transformation of social relations, is pro-force, a movement that has to react to events or social pressures rather than work things out at their own pace. We never have time to really address everything. Consequently, even before we can deal with one set of problems in our societies, we are overtaken by others. Something along these lines is happening currently. While we are still at the right-wing political formation, they've captured state power, bringing in new complexities, but now we are also caught from the early 90s in the phase of economic developments. Caught in a vortex of mounting external debt and under pressure from the World Bank and IMF structural adjustment, liberalization and privatization were the key elements through which development is now finally arriving in India. By now we have been globalized for about a decade, and we can see some of its consequences unfolding. The state has abdicated whatever little role it was playing in education and healthcare and retreated quite happily under IMF and World Bank conditionalities. A euphemism for their diktat to its grossest and minimalist function, and that is police its own people. That's the only function left for the state. You take social welfare out of the state, what is left? The army and the police. There's nothing else. That's it. That is your state. Yeah? I mean, that is my state. Okay. Now I find, for instance, that my class, my class compatriots, I'm from a privileged class, will often say to me, they're so happy about this globalization. Globalization, you're getting these goods that are coming in. And they're so pleased. And what is your notion of the state? Is it now going to be just this? And when I put it like that boldly to them, they are a bit shocked. Because, if the state is reduced to its minimalist function, that's all it is, then it is a bit, it is somewhat naked and brutal. Because for the rest, everybody can come in and do their own thing, and the state will be nowhere around. So, and I think it's very important for us to remember that. You see, liberalization and globalization have very different consequences for third world countries than they have for the first world countries. In first world countries, if you are now going to withdraw if the state is now retreating from its social welfarist function, it's a slightly different situation. We didn't even have it. We didn't have those systems in place. We're already withdrawing. I mean, they've had at least, food for work or whatever it is for some centuries. England में तो 100 साल से उनके पास social welfare है. I mean, through struggles and so on, they had it. And now they're giving it up under Thatcher. We didn't get it. We haven't got it, and we're already abandoning it. So what is the consequence that we're going to have? We will remain poor. And our poverty will increase in very dramatic ways. So that's really what we are having to deal with. Now, the point that is important in all this is the right wing is perfectly happy to go along with these developments. The right wing is not questioning global capitalism. The right wing is not questioning economic, the money coming. But it is actually quite an interesting scenario. You will nevertheless use now, what is globalization finally reduced to? It is what you see on television. So all you will now resist is on the grain of culture. So you'll say, our culture is collapsing. Our values are going away. And this is what happened. We had the right wing, only time it protested was over the Miss World beauty contest. And so you had this peculiar scenario in which the right and the left were all together in this protest because they were protesting the Miss World contest being held in Bangalore, which the state, the Karnataka state actually providing you special roads and so on the ground that we are having this big global event in our country. And of course you had this. You must have, I don't know if you noticed this, but there was this very peculiar classic, sort of ambiguity that they displayed by the elites who have this ambiguous position on culture. Beauty contest, the swimsuit contest we didn't have in India. That we did in the Maldives. We did the full-scale contest and then you gave the award. Now imagine the structural contradiction of these characters. That is, you're playing with it all the time and you're wanting the games of it, and you're also having this hypocrisy in which you pretend that you've got your culture intact. And of course, at the background painted all around were the beauties from Ajanta. So you indigenized the Miss World contest also. So you did. So this is the other thing that you did. Now, you see, we are in a situation where, as a consequence of all this, only very briefly, look at the production system. Women had not fully joined the workforce. You're already back under the new structural adjustment, you are now having a situation where women are doing work in the home. So you have the sweatshops and so on, or these. You're back to the putting out system which you had during the Industrial Revolution. So you will be given goods to do, which you can do sitting at home, and you don't even have to go to work. You don't have to go out. You are within the private domain. You don't have to go out. You will be producing. You will be exploited, but you cannot mobilize because there aren't 25 of you in the same place. A trade union requires, or whatever facilities require that you at least 25 of you. And at the same time, because of the conjuncture that is taking place, the face of your exploiter is not known. It's disappeared. We don't know who I. You see, when you're working inside my house, there are 3.5 dozen people in between you. You don't know where your exploiter is, and that he's sitting somewhere in the United States of America or in somewhere in Singapore or whatever. You don't know. So the faces of exploitation are itself getting removed, and you don't know where they are. And at the same time, you get this situation where you are returning to a degree of cultural nationalism, because you're saying we must preserve the family. There's a tremendous hype about the family. Serials, films that you see, the family is everywhere. I mean, I suppose a lot of people in Pakistan might have seen Hum Aapke Hain Kaun. I don't know if you did, but it's really a pathetic film. 14 songs. You don't get out from one song before you get into another. The whole thing is what we call a shadi ka video, because the whole thing is just like a shadi ka video. That is first you have the engagement, then you have the whatever it is, and it's song and dance, song and dance, song and dance. Now the narrative, the background to that is that there is this man who set up a multinational industry. So the hero is someone who has a multinational firm. So in the background you get all those connections also going on. Now who's the young girl? The young girl is someone who can go on the roller skates, does computer, but is willing to marry her sister's husband, her jija, because it will save the family. So there is this fantastic ability for you to be global as well as local. And you can reconcile that. The modern South Asian woman can do both. She can rise to modernity, she can go back into tradition. I mean, she's really the multi-armed character. Because she preserves within her this entire body of tradition. So essentially then, you have a very peculiar scenario that we're caught back again. We hardly got out of colonialism, we're back into a phase of new neo-colonialism, imperialism, and that's the situation that the women's movements have to confront. Now, a point that I want to make over here. It's true that what I've suggested is, it's a huge task, but the women's movement, and I honestly say this, and I'm glad that there are some left friends over here, I think the women's movement at the moment is the only movement that can conceptually address the widest range of contradictions and oppressions that our areas experience. And I want to say this because whether it's social security, whether it's nuclearization, whether it's militarization, whether it is, whether it's education, whether it is social welfare, social security, the range, ecology, every single class, caste, gender, all. That is, they are all within the framework of women's conceptualization, the women's movement's conceptualization. So in terms of being able to understand the connections between all of these, and also to be able to address them, because the women's movement does not address only gender oppression, it has also addressed all these other oppressions. And therefore, we are in the best placed position to actually be able to try and address all the multiplicity of contradictions that we have. And on that note, and that hopeful note, we are the only people who can bridge. I want to say this, we are the only people who can actually create these connections across South Asia. The women's movement has been the only one that's done it. And next to it has been the democratic rights movement. But the women's movement has actually achieved this. And so to my mind, this is the positive point about the women's movement, and I think on that note, I can end and say, we hope that we can actually carry the burden forward and carry with us as many democratic people as we can towards a less exploitative society. Now, on that, we can layers globally. That's the only kind of globalization I'm agreeable to. A globalization in which all oppression, all people against oppressions can join together. That's the only form of globalization that is acceptable to us at this point of time. Thank you.